Welcome back to Economic Outlook. Today we're going to build off our previous discussions of oil and gas prices to talk about an industry that's in distress, and that's the airline industry. I'm sure you've seen the headlines, whether it's fuel costs, bad marketing campaigns, or an unending stream of PR gaffes. Airlines can't seem to do anything right these days. We're going to look at the root cause of all these issues: gross mismanagement. To do this, we'll look at a history of the airlines from the 1920s up through deregulation. Next, we'll look at deregulation itself and some of the fundamental changes that it brought to the industry. Finally, we'll look at the industry today to see exactly what's driving the massive losses that are being reported. After that, we'll go into more detail and look at some specific solutions the airlines could employ to try to restore their profitability. So, I hope you enjoy this discussion of the airlines, and we'll start with a history of the airlines before deregulation. The history of commercial aviation dates back to the 1920s, when the Ford Motor Company released its tri-motor aircraft. This plane could seat 12 passengers and was the first to prove that commercial air travel was economically viable. After this, other companies released their own aircraft, like the Boeing 247 and the Douglas DC-3. However, these were limited by the technology at the time, and it wasn't until after World War II that we saw international and national expansion on a large scale. After World War II, the B-29 bomber inspired researchers to investigate pressurization technology, which allowed planes to fly at higher altitudes and greater speeds. This paved the way for jumbo jets like the Boeing 747 and the Douglas DC-10 in the 1970s. Ultimately, these jumbo jets allowed for the commercialization of air travel to be greatly expanded. Beginning in 1938, American airlines were governed as a public utility by the Civil Aeronautics Board, or CAB. This agency set fares, routes, and schedules for air travel. As time wore on, however, the agency became increasingly criticized for being inefficient, failing to adapt to new technology, and far too slow in allocating new routes. Ultimately, the introduction of the jumbo jet coincided with the deregulation of the U.S. airline industry, and more than anything, these two factors are responsible for the explosive growth we've seen in air travel over the past 30 years. The deregulation of the U.S. air industry had important consequences. One of the most immediate was the lowered barrier to entry for new carriers, which caused a dramatic decrease in fares and an explosion in demand. It also allowed airlines to set their own routes, and we saw movement from the traditional point-to-point route method to the hub-and-spoke system that we're more familiar with today. This mix of new carriers, lower fares, and surging demand allowed for enormous growth in the U.S. air industry in the 1980s. By the mid-80s, almost half of the flying done in the world occurred in the domestic United States, with almost 10,000 flights taking off every day. In addition, we saw the emergence of new low-cost carriers who sought to compete with legacy carriers based solely on price. These carriers would reduce cost, offer fewer amenities, but also offer dramatically lower fares, which put pressure on legacy carriers to reduce their fares as well. Since deregulation, competition between budget carriers and legacy carriers has increased. Passengers have benefited by seeing lower fares, but not all of the effects have been positive. Most of the legacy carriers have been forced to declare bankruptcy at some point since deregulation, and many budget carriers have gone in and out of Chapter 11 as well. It's important to understand why the airline industry seems to be particularly beset with problems, and the answer is that most airlines are mismanaged. What we're going to do next is look at the costs and revenues associated with airlines and figure out exactly what's causing airlines to post the record losses we're seeing on a day-to-day basis. The main reason why airlines are so unprofitable is that they generate insufficient revenues to cover their costs of doing business. We'll go over the costs of doing business first, and then we'll shift to the revenue side. The main fixed cost any airline incurs is, of course, its fleet of airplanes, and this is problematic for several reasons. Airlines have to make their purchase and leasing decisions years in advance of actually using the aircraft. As you can see from this chart, The average age of a plane in Delta's fleet is 12.4 years old. Its most popular passenger jet, the 767, has an average age of 16.4 years. Now, when you have a large fleet of aircraft like this, it increases maintenance costs and it causes some depreciation concerns. The most important factor, though, is that it reduces the airline's flexibility. Once the airline selects its route system and has its planes in place, it's very difficult to change them because the planes are such a large fixed cost. Legacy carriers have made their purchase and lease decisions on the assumption that they would operate under the hub and spoke route system. However, smaller carriers like Southwest Airlines are bringing back point-to-point routes and using one type of aircraft to reduce maintenance expenses. This means that smaller carriers can compete directly on price with the major legacy carriers. Since airlines are locked into their plane purchases, their route structures are restricted. Ever since deregulation, legacy carriers have focused on growing the volume of passengers they transport and increasing the breadth of routes they offer. This means they aren't set up to be a low-cost carrier. They're more focused on growing revenue. However, that hasn't stopped legacy carriers from trying to compete on price with budget carriers. This means that the margins legacy carriers enjoy shrink to almost nothing, and any increase in variable costs can eradicate potential profits.